Rain hammered the cab window the night everything changed. A stranger slid in beside me, breathless, so laughing. Our eyes met and the meter kept running. Forgotten. I told the driver my address twice. I lied. Weeks later, a diamond ring sat heavy on my hand. Then a photograph leaked, and my whole life cracked open. I had one night to choose who I really was. My name is Mara Whitfield, an architect at my family's Chicago firm, engaged since spring to a man I respected but never truly loved. I designed buildings that stood for decades, yet I had never built a single honest room inside my own heart. Until that rainy night. The cab stalled at a red light near Michigan Avenue. Rain drumming so hard neither of us heard the driver ask where she was headed. She introduced herself as Josephine. Paramedic shift just ended. Paint still under her fingernails from a mural she'd started at dawn. I offered to split the fare since our routes overlapped for 6 blocks. Though secretly I hoped the ride would somehow stretch longer. She laughed at something small I said. A real laugh. And I felt something unfamiliar loosen in my chest for the first time in years. When we reached my building, she wrote her number on a coffee receipt and told me to call if I ever needed rescuing. I didn't call for 4 days, terrified of what wanting to call actually meant about the life I had already promised someone else. On the 5th day I texted her one word. Coffee, and she replied instantly with 3 exclamation points and an address. We met at a diner near the hospital where she worked, and she talked about saving lives like it was the most ordinary thing. I found myself watching her hands more than listening to her words, noticing how gently she stirred sugar into black coffee. She asked about the ring on my finger, and I gave the answer I always gave. That Daniel and I made sense on paper. Joe didn't push. Just said quietly that paper marriages built cold houses, and I couldn't stop thinking about that sentence for days. We started meeting weekly, always calling it coffee, though we both knew coffee had stopped being the real reason long before either admitted it. One evening she showed me the mural she was painting, a wall of open doors, and asked which one I would actually walk through. Autumn came fast that year, and so did the excuse I invented every Thursday night to disappear for 2 hours without explaining where. Joe taught me to sit still on a lakefront bench without checking my phone, something I hadn't managed since architecture school finals. I learned she'd been estranged from her own father since 19. After he told her a daughter like her embarrassed the family name, she said it plainly. No self-pity. Just fact. And I admired how she'd built a life without waiting for his approval to return. I told her about my father's heart attack 2 years earlier, how a paramedic's steady hands had kept him breathing until the ambulance arrived. Joe went quiet, then admitted she'd worked that exact route that winter, though she couldn't be sure it was the same call. The coincidence unsettled me pleasantly, like the city itself had been quietly stitching our lives together long before that rainy taxi. Daniel noticed I was distracted during our engagement dinner planning, and I blamed a difficult client instead of the truth sitting in my chest. My mother, Eleanor, called twice that week to discuss centerpieces, and I realized I couldn't picture myself standing at that altar anymore. Joe and I started sharing playlists, then sketches, then small pieces of ourselves neither of us had shown anyone in years. One night, walking her home, our hands brushed and neither of us pulled away. The silence between us suddenly loud with meaning. She stopped under a streetlight, studied my face like she was memorizing it, and asked if I felt what she felt too. I said I didn't know how to answer that without unraveling everything I'd spent a lifetime carefully building for other people. She nodded, unhurt, and said she'd wait, though her eyes told me waiting cost her something she wasn't saying out loud. That night I lay awake replaying her question, terrified that the honest answer had been forming inside me for weeks already. I canceled a dress fitting to see her instead, telling my mother I had a work emergency. My first real lie in years. Joe showed me her studio. Canvases stacked against brick walls, each one an open door she'd painted since her father closed his. I confessed I hadn't drawn anything just for myself since college, and she handed me a brush like it was the most natural gift. We painted badly. Laughing. Paint on our clothes. And for 1 hour I forgot I was supposed to be somebody's future wife. When she walked me out, she kissed my cheek softly, and I felt the ghost of it for 3 days afterward. Daniel proposed we move the wedding earlier, citing his father's business timeline, and I agreed before I'd even processed the request. I hated myself a little for how easily I said yes to him and how hard I fought every word around Joe. Joe asked directly one evening if Daniel made me happy, and I gave a long answer that avoided the actual word happy entirely. She said she noticed I laughed differently around her, freer, and asked if I'd ever laughed like that with him. I couldn't answer. So instead I reached for her hand, and this time neither of us treated it as an accident. We sat like that for an hour, fingers laced, watching boats cross the harbor, saying nothing because nothing needed saying. That was the night I first admitted, quietly, that I thought about her more than I thought about my own wedding. Joe cupped my face and asked permission before she kissed me, and I said yes before she'd even finished the question. The kiss was soft, certain. Nothing like the practice kisses Daniel and I exchanged out of habit rather than hunger. Walking home alone afterward, cried on the train. Not from regret but from finally recognizing what real wanting felt like. I avoided Joe for a week, drowning in guilt, rehearsing sentences to end things before they became something I couldn't undo. She texted just one line. "I'm not asking you to choose tonight. Just don't disappear." And I broke down reading it. We met again at the same lakefront bench, and I admitted I was terrified of losing everyone if I chose honesty. Joe said she understood fear better than most, having lost her father to the exact same silence I was protecting. I told her I needed time, and she said time was fine, but lying to myself never actually bought anyone real peace. For the next month we existed in careful stolen hours, coffee shops, empty galleries, anywhere Daniel's world couldn't accidentally intersect ours. My mother mentioned my Aunt Rachel in passing, a name I'd never once heard growing up, then quickly changed the subject. I asked my father about Rachel later, and he only said quietly that some doors in our family stayed shut for decades. The mystery nagged at me, though I had little energy to chase it while juggling a wedding and a secret relationship simultaneously. Joe's shifts grew brutal that month, a string of overdoses and accidents, and I started showing up at the hospital just to see her face. She'd come out exhausted, and I'd hand her coffee and a sandwich, and something about that ritual felt more like marriage than my actual engagement did. One night she admitted she was falling for me, fully, dangerously, and asked if I could ever say the same without flinching.
I told her I loved her.
The words arriving easier than I expected, like they'd been waiting behind my teeth for weeks. She smiled like I'd handed her something fragile and precious, then kissed me right there in the hospital parking lot. We started imagining a future in fragments, an apartment with good light, a dog, Sunday mornings that belonged to no one else. I knew imagining was dangerous while a wedding invitation sat printed and stamped in a drawer at my parents' house. Daniel caught me smiling at my phone during dinner and asked, half joking, if I was texting someone more interesting than him. I laughed it off, but the question sat in my stomach like a stone for the rest of that entire evening. Joe asked when I planned to tell Daniel, gently, without pressure, though I could hear the worry underneath her calm voice. Promised soon. A word I'd been using for weeks, and she let it go, though her jaw tightened slightly each time. That night I stood in front of my mirror in my wedding dress and didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. I finally understood that loving Joe meant I could no longer keep living two separate, carefully organized, dishonest lives. My mother found a sketch Joe had given me tucked inside my planner and asked, too casually, who the artist was. I lied and said a coworker, and my mother's eyes lingered a second too long, like she already suspected more. Daniel's father announced the merger paperwork would finalize right after the wedding, tying our companies together for the next decade. I realized my engagement had quietly become collateral in a business deal neither Daniel nor I had ever truly agreed to. Jo grew distant that week, tired of stolen hours, and told me she needed to know I was actually choosing her. I panicked and said I needed more time. And she walked away without arguing, which frightened me more than any fight would have. 3 days of silence followed, each one heavier than the last, until I finally understood how badly I'd hurt her. I showed up at her apartment uninvited, soaked again in rain, and told her I was done pretending to be undecided. She let me in but stayed guarded, saying words were easy and she needed to see actions match them this time. I promised to tell Daniel the truth before the rehearsal dinner, giving myself a real deadline for the first time. That same week, my colleague Vanessa noticed me leaving Jo's building early one morning and asked pointed questions at the office. I brushed her off, but Vanessa had always resented losing a promotion to me, and I sensed she wouldn't forget easily. My father collapsed briefly at work, a minor scare, and the family gathered at the hospital, fear briefly uniting all of us. Jo happened to be on shift and recognized my father instantly, connecting him to the call she'd worked years earlier. Watching her steady his vitals with the same calm competence that once saved him, I felt the coincidence become something closer to fate. My father, recovering, thanked her by name, then studied us both a beat too long, something clearly shifting behind his eyes. Later that night he asked me directly, gently, if Josephine meant more to me than a paramedic who happened to save him twice. I froze, unprepared. And he simply said he'd suspected for weeks and only wanted me to stop carrying it alone. My father's quiet acceptance gave me courage, but my mother remained the wall I still didn't know how to approach. I decided to ask her directly about Aunt Rachel, hoping understanding her past might help me predict her reaction to mine. My mother's hands shook slightly as she finally admitted Rachel had loved a woman in the 70s and was disowned by my grandfather. She said she'd spent decades regretting her silence back then, yet somehow I could tell she wasn't ready to break that pattern now. I told her I was in love with a woman, watching 3 generations of unspoken fear cross her face in an instant. She didn't yell, only whispered that I would lose everything. The wedding, the firm's merger, maybe even the family's standing. I said I would rather lose all of that than lose myself the way Rachel apparently had lost her place at our table. My mother left the room without another word, and the silence that followed felt more devastating than any argument could have. Daniel called that same evening, oddly quiet, and asked if we could talk somewhere private before the rehearsal dinner Friday. I assumed my mother had told him everything, and I spent the entire drive over rehearsing an apology I never got to give. Instead, Daniel confessed first, voice shaking, that he'd been seeing a man named Peter for over a year and felt trapped too. We sat stunned across from each other, realizing our entire engagement had quietly become 2 people protecting different, equally exhausting secrets. He admitted his father needed this marriage for the merger, and he'd been too afraid to disappoint him the same way I was. For the first time in months I laughed genuinely with Daniel, relief flooding through both of us like a shared exhale. We agreed to end the engagement together, honestly, rather than let 2 families' expectations force us into decades of quiet unhappiness. Daniel warned me his father would be furious and might retaliate against my family's firm once the truth became public. I told Jo everything that night, and she held me for a long time before saying we still weren't fully safe yet. The next morning, Vanessa forwarded a blurry photo of Jo and me kissing outside the hospital to half the office's group chat. By noon it had reached my mother, and by evening it had somehow reached Daniel's father. Exactly the retaliation Daniel had feared. My mother called, furious and humiliated, saying I had embarrassed the family publicly before I'd even had the chance to explain privately. The Cross family threatened to pull out of the merger entirely, blaming scandal. Though the real scandal was 2 people finally being honest. My father's firm stood to lose its biggest contract in a decade, and board members began quietly questioning his judgment openly. I offered to resign from the firm to protect my father's position, but he refused, saying no contract was worth that price. Jo, watching the fallout from a distance, said she wouldn't blame me if I needed space to fix my family's mess first. I told her firmly that I wasn't choosing space. I was choosing her. Even if the timing felt catastrophically inconvenient right now. My mother stopped answering my calls for a week, and I feared Rachel's old exile was about to quietly repeat itself with me. I found Rachel's old address in my father's desk, a small detail he'd apparently kept hidden even from my mother all these years. I drove 3 hours to find her, uncertain if she'd even want to speak to the niece she'd never once been allowed to meet. Rachel opened the door cautiously, then broke into tears the moment I said my mother's name and explained who I was. She told me she'd spent 40 years waiting for someone from that family to knock, and never once expected it to actually happen. I asked her how she survived losing everyone, and she said slowly, painfully, that survival was never the same as forgiveness for them. I brought Rachel back to Chicago with me, deciding my mother needed to face the cost of that old silence directly. My mother opened the door, saw her estranged sister standing beside me, and for a long moment neither woman could speak at all. Rachel finally said, "I'm not here for an apology. I'm here because Mara shouldn't have to lose me the way I lost you." My mother invited Rachel to sit, the first small crack in 40 years of practiced avoidance finally beginning to show. They talked for hours while I waited outside, unsure whether I just healed something or reopened a wound too old to close. When Rachel left, my mother hugged me tightly and said she was still afraid, but afraid wasn't the same as unwilling anymore. Meanwhile, the merger crisis worsened, and my father was summoned to an emergency board meeting to explain the scandal's fallout. I offered to speak to the board myself, standing in front of men who'd known me since childhood, refusing to apologize for loving Jo. Some board members softened, others stayed cold. But my father later said he'd never been prouder of anything I'd done at that firm. Just as things steadied, Jo's ex-girlfriend Sam resurfaced, texting Jo late one night asking urgently to meet somewhere private. Jealousy hit me harder than I expected. Old fears about not being enough resurfacing despite everything we'd already survived together. Jo insisted it was nothing romantic, but wouldn't explain further, only asking me to trust her for one more difficult night. I waited at her apartment, imagining worse scenarios by the hour, until she finally returned pale and visibly shaken near midnight. Sam, turned out, was pregnant, alone, and terrified. Having nowhere else to turn after her own family cut her off recently. Jo had once been the only person who accepted Sam fully, and Sam had nowhere left to call in an emergency. I felt ashamed of my jealousy once I understood, and instead helped Jo find Sam a shelter and prenatal care that week. Watching Jo care for someone with no expectation of anything returned taught me something about the kind of love I actually wanted. Just as that crisis calmed, a hospital in Seattle offered Jo a senior paramedic training position, doubling her salary within months. She hesitated to tell me at first, afraid I'd think she was running from everything happening in Chicago right now. When she finally admitted it, I felt the floor tilt, terrified our entire fragile, hard-won relationship might not survive that distance. Jo said she hadn't decided, but the opportunity mattered because it was the first time anyone had chosen her professional worth first. I told her honestly I couldn't ask her to stay just because I was afraid. That wouldn't be love. Just fear wearing love's clothes. We fought that night. Not cruelly, but honestly. Both admitting we were terrified of losing momentum we'd fought so hard to build. She said maybe we needed the distance to prove whether what we had could survive something harder than secrecy and scandal. I left her apartment that night unsure, for the first time in weeks, whether our story was actually heading toward an ending. My mother, of all people, found me crying on her porch steps and asked what on earth could shake me that badly. I told her everything, and she surprised me by saying Rachel's biggest regret wasn't loving a woman, it was letting fear choose silence. She said if I truly loved Jo, Silence and hesitation would cost me exactly what it had cost Rachel and their whole family. Her words rattled around my head for days, especially since months earlier she'd been the loudest voice against this relationship existing at all. Daniel, now openly dating Peter, called to check on me, saying secrets almost cost him everything, and he refused to watch me repeat that. He reminded me the rehearsal dinner venue was still booked, and joked I should use it for something braver than a wedding. An idea started forming, reckless and clear. The kind of idea that only made sense once I stopped overthinking every consequence. I called every person who mattered. My parents, Rachel, Daniel, even Vanessa, inviting them to the same venue that Friday evening. I didn't call Joe, afraid she'd talk me out of it, or worse, that I'd lose my nerve hearing her voice. The Seattle deadline for her decision was the same Friday night, and I knew by morning she might already be gone. Friday arrived cold and clear, and I stood at the same venue meant for vows I never intended to make with Daniel. My mother arrived first, still nervous but present, followed by Rachel, then my father, then Daniel and Peter holding hands openly. Vanessa came too, awkward and apologetic, admitting the leaked photo had been petty jealousy she deeply regretted causing so much damage. I forgave her quickly, mostly because holding on to that anger felt smaller than everything else happening around me that night. The room filled slowly with people who had, in their own imperfect ways, chosen to show up despite every complication I'd caused. I checked my phone obsessively. No message from Joe. And the silence began to feel like an answer I wasn't ready for. At 7 o'clock, the hour her flight was scheduled to board, I made a decision that terrified me more than any board meeting had. I left the venue and drove straight to O'Hare, breaking every speed limit, praying traffic would somehow bend around my urgency. I abandoned my car in short-term parking and ran through security lines, badge from the firm somehow getting me past one checkpoint. I spotted her gate number on the departure board and sprinted, lungs burning, past strangers who barely glanced up from their phones. I reached the gate just as they called final boarding, and for one terrible second I thought I'd missed her entirely. Then I saw her, seated near the window, staring at her boarding pass instead of standing in the growing line. I called her name across the gate, and every head turned except hers, frozen like she couldn't trust what she just heard. She finally looked up, eyes wide, and I said the only sentence that mattered. I choose you. Out loud. In front of everyone. Joe stood slowly, boarding pass still in her hand, and asked if I understood what choosing her would actually cost me now. I told her I'd already lost the version of my life built on hiding, and I refused to lose her too on top of that. She walked toward me instead of toward the gate agent, and the airline attendant quietly closed the boarding door behind her. We stood in the middle of the terminal, strangers filming on their phones, while I finally kissed her without checking who was watching. She laughed through tears and said she'd been ready to board and hate herself for not waiting 5 more minutes for me. I told her I'd never again make her wait for a truth I already knew the moment we sat in that shared cab. We drove back from the airport together. Her flight rebooked for a week later, this time as a visit rather than an exit. The venue was mostly empty when we returned, except for my parents and Rachel, who'd waited despite the late, uncertain hour. My mother saw us walk in together and, without hesitation this time, crossed the room and hugged Joe like she already belonged. She admitted quietly that watching me run through an airport for love had taught her more than 40 years of careful silence ever had. Rachel cried again, saying she never imagined living long enough to watch her family choose love out loud instead of quiet shame. My father shook Joe's hand and thanked her twice, once for saving his life, once for teaching his daughter real courage. The board's decision came the following Monday, and surprisingly the merger survived, though restructured without the Cross family's controlling terms. Several younger board members had privately supported me all along, saying the firm needed leaders who valued honesty over appearances anyway. Daniel and Peter announced their own relationship publicly soon after. no longer hiding behind arranged engagements or nervous family expectations. Vanessa, in an unexpected turn, became one of my strongest allies at the firm, perhaps guilt-driven, though the change felt genuine. Sam gave birth to a healthy daughter that winter, and Jo became the child's godmother, closing an old chapter with real tenderness. I watched Jo hold that baby and understood love wasn't just romantic. It was the countless quiet ways she showed up for people. We moved into a small apartment with good afternoon light, exactly the kind we'd once imagined in fragments during stolen coffee dates. Jo kept painting doors, though now she painted them open, hung across our walls like a record of every choice we'd made. My mother started attending a support group for parents learning to accept LGBTQ children, awkward at first, then genuinely committed over time. She apologized formally at a family dinner, admitting fear had cost her a sister once and nearly cost her a daughter too. I forgave her, not because the pain hadn't been real, but because watching her actively change meant more than any lingering resentment. Rachel became a regular presence at family dinners, filling 40 years of absence with stories, terrible jokes, and genuine warmth. The firm thrived under its restructured leadership, and I was eventually promoted to lead architect, designing with an honesty I'd once lacked. Jo declined the Seattle position permanently, choosing instead to train Chicago's next generation of paramedics closer to everyone who mattered here. We hosted a small gathering that spring. Not a wedding exactly, just family and close friends celebrating simply being together. Daniel gave a toast, joking that our shared broken engagement had somehow produced too much happier, more honest relationships instead. My father, healthier than he'd been in years, danced clumsily with my mother while Rachel laughed loud enough to fill the whole yard. I found Jo by the drink table and asked, half joking, if she remembered the exact taxi fare from that first rainy night. She said she remembered every detail, especially the moment she decided not to let me walk away without her number. I told her I'd never actually needed rescuing that night, only redirecting toward a life I hadn't yet let myself imagine. We talked about the future carefully now, no longer in fragments, but in real plans. An adoption someday, a studio of our own. Some relatives from my father's side still kept a polite, uneasy distance, and I accepted that healing wouldn't reach every corner equally. Jo said that was fine. Real love didn't need universal approval, only enough steady people willing to show up when it mattered most. I thought often about Rachel, about the decades she'd lost simply because our family chose silence over one uncomfortable, necessary conversation. I promised myself our future children, if we had them, would never inherit that particular inheritance of quiet, careful shame. Vanessa sent flowers to our small gathering with a card that simply read, "Glad the truth finally won," and I believed she meant it. Sam visited occasionally with her daughter, and watching Jo become an accidental auntie to a child who wasn't biologically hers felt like family expanding, not shrinking. My mother asked one evening, tentatively, if she could help plan something for us someday, and I let her. Slowly. Rebuilding trust. I realized courage hadn't been one dramatic airport sprint, but hundreds of smaller honest choices that made that sprint possible at all. Jo and I stood on our apartment balcony one evening, watching the same lake we used to sit beside on that early bench. She asked if I had any regrets about how publicly, messily, our story had unfolded in front of everyone who mattered. I said the only regret was the 4 days I'd waited to call her after that first rainy taxi ride together. She laughed, pulled me close, and said 4 days was nothing compared to the lifetime we'd apparently decided to spend making up for it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't designing a future for someone else's approval. I was finally building one entirely my own. Looking back, that rainy cab ride wasn't a detour from my real life. It was the exact moment my real life finally began honestly. Jo squeezed my hand under the string lights, and I knew, without any doubt left, that I had never once regretted missing that flight. Fendi.